Hello everyone, welcome back to my videos. Today we're going to talk about the kangaroo and map issues of Australia. I'm doing these separately from the George V heads because there's different aspects that apply to each issue, and I think they're best covered in separate videos. So the first thing to note with these issues is difference in terminology. The Australians use different names for the watermarks and the dies, or I should say Gibbons uses different names for the dies from the Scott catalog. So I'm going to put a table up on my website again at the end of this week to go through differences between them, the terminology, so that people using Scott can understand the Gibbons terms and vice versa. So there are 5 watermarks used on this set. The first watermark is a wide flat-topped crown over an A. The second one is a pointed crown over A. The third watermark is a narrower crown with a flat top over the A. That's the most common watermark found on this issue. And then we get the multiple watermark on which is the fourth watermark, and it's called the small multiple watermark in Australia. And it's a series of crowns with an A beside the crowns and very tightly packed together. The fifth watermark is called the C of A watermark, and it's crowns with the letter C of A in between the crowns, which stands for Commonwealth of Australia. It's the watermark found all the way through the George VI reign and into the early Elizabeth stamps before the abandonment of watermarks. Okay, so from a practical point of view, the difficulty in identification for novices on this issue concerns the first and third watermarks. They often look very similar if you're not experienced in determining them. The easiest way to identify the first watermark is to look at the weave of the paper, because so the weave of the paper is how the stamp bends. So this is a first watermark 2-penny, and on the first watermark they all bend this way because they're all on horizontal wove paper. That's the easiest way to determine the first watermark stamp. The only exception to this would be the sideways watermark on the 1-penny, but it's a major rarity that's only ever been handled by a few Australian auction houses. You're not going to see it in practice. So you can use that test to identify and isolate all your first watermarks. Anything with a crown that has a flat top over an A that's not that's vertical wove instead of horizontal, will be third watermark. Now the Australians call these watermarks first, second, and third watermarks. That's how they refer to them. Gibbons has a numbering system, so does Scott. And Scott's numbers are totally different from Gibbons' numbers. Gibbons, I think, uses 2, 5, 6, 7, 8 to identify them. Scott uses numbers that vary between, I think, 10 all the way up to 225 for the different watermarks. So they don't actually use the description of what the watermark looks like. Now, in terms of perforation, there's really no issue on identifying perfs on the roos because they're all perf 12. Just jumping back for a minute. Second watermark is a little difficult to identify because oftentimes, well, I should say most of the time, the watermark is not centered, so you can't usually see the full crown. And the reason for that is that this paper was intended for use on the George V heads, which are a wider design, and so they don't, the stamps, the watermark, I should say, doesn't fit within the dimensions of the stamp. But the key again is to look at the top of the crown if you can see enough of that on the stamp, then you should be able to make out whether it's a second or a third watermark. And the reason why the Kangaroos and the second watermark are as valuable as they are is because they weren't meant to be printed on this paper. It was in use from 1914 to 15, which is the beginning of the First World War, and my guess is that they were using up supplies of existing paper for the George V heads while they waited to produce a paper specifically for the width of this design, which they did when they introduced the third watermark. Now, jumping back to perfs, when you look at the third watermark, you will find many instances where the perforations are quite rough and fluffy and ill-defined. A lot of collectors have shunned those stamps, but I think that they're perfectly collectible. What they are the initial printings of the third watermark made in 1915 to about 1917 during the war. And they're that way presumably because as the perforators wore out and the pins got dull, they just didn't replace them because they had other priorities during the war. And after the war, they started using new perforators, new pins, and you got, well-defined perforations at the end of the war. So if you're collecting, the third watermark is the most common watermark because it's the longest running period in the Kangaroo series. It ran from 1915 to 27. So, if you're looking through a bunch of third watermarks, your clean cut perfs, generally speaking, are from 1918 and on. Everything before that will have rough perfs, so from a practical point of view. In terms of shades, there's lots of shades on this issue. I just did a lot of 9-penny violets from the C of A watermark where I had 8 different shades. So Gibbons does list some of the shades, but not all of them. And you can find shades on pretty well every value of this issue. So that's there's that. Now the last thing I want to go through is the dies. So I'm going to hold the 2-penny Kangaroo up again. And so the first die is die 1. And what it is there in the inner frame line, there will be a little break above the first letter of the value. And it's quite a small break. If you have a stamp that doesn't have that break, i.e. die 2, the line will be nice and fluid and smooth with no interruptions, no anomalies, no blurring, it will just be a clear line. So you have to be very careful when identifying die 1 from die 2 because the break is not always distinct. It can sometimes be very small. But if the line there isn't smooth and fluid, it's die 1. Now, die 2 is straightforward, as I said. It's a continuous frame line with no break at that point. Now, that being said, there are, on this issue, a lot of random breaks that occur on the inner frame line in different spots from the ones that concern the die types. And so when you're identifying the dies, the breaks have to be in the right place. Otherwise, they're not the die types that are indicated. Some of these breaks are significant. Some of them are listed in the Brusden White catalog, which is the Australian specialized catalog, but most of them aren't. So the next die is die 2A, which in Scott is listed as die 3. And die 2A is a break which occurs about 9 millimeters down in the inner frame line here. I'm just going to get that right around here. And it's directly across from there's a little bit of landmass that juts out where the map comes down here. And it's about directly across from that 9 millimeters down. Again, it's not a very wide break. It can be hard to see, but if it's not there in that spot, and if what you have is a fluid line at that spot, then you have die 2. You don't have die 2A. And that becomes important because die 2A on the early printings is a substituted cliche variety, and it's worth quite a lot of money in Gibbons, and it can be easy to misidentify and to think you've got a die 2A substituted cliche when you just have die 2. Quite often that happens where you've got a break, either significantly above that spot or just below it. It has to be in the right spot. So then there's die 2B, which is listed in Gibbons as die 4. And that is a small diagonal break. This time it's in the outer frame line and it's above the ST of Australia. And it's a small diagonal slash break like this. Now again, it's not always a distinct break. It can be almost partly closed. It's a hairline break. So normally the outer frame line is very, very solid and uninterrupted. So when you're trying to identify die 4 or 2B, it's best to look very carefully at the frame line above the ST of Australia, and if it appears interrupted or blurry, take a very good look at it because it's probably a die 2B. That die only occurs on certain printings of the third watermark and on, so you don't need to look for it on the first and second watermarks. So that's it for the die types, and other than that, there's really just the OS perfins. Now you will see a number of other perfins on this issue. So the OS perfins came in a large OS and a small OS, and the large OS covers almost the full length of the stamp. It only occurred on the first watermark because the stamps had a tendency to fall apart due to how weak they were when they were separated. So they abandoned that and moved to the small OS very shortly after. But you're also going to see things like this. So there's an OS New South Wales perfin. That's not listed in either Gibbons or Scott's, and would be of interest to a perfin collector. There's a W perfin on a shilling, and there's some other perfins, HB sideways. If we could just see on this 1 shilling stamp here. I was trying to show you, I don't know how visible that is. I tried to put my hand up there to show you. But those kinds of perfins you will encounter every once in a while, and those are more of interest to a perfin collector. Another thing you'll see sometimes on these stamps, the cancellations, you'll get accounts for like telephone receipts and things like that, telegraph cancels. Some Australian collectors will devalue these and say they're not postal cancels and they're not really worth much, but my general feeling now is that, you know, any nice cancel on these stamps will be fully collectible to most collectors. Another thing to watch for is cancel to order. You will occasionally come across stamps of this issue that have a corner cancel at the very bottom. It'll usually be very thin and they'll have gum on the back. Now those are from souvenir folders put out by the post office. They used to be very, very inexpensive and not desirable, but lately in the last 20 years, the Australian specialist catalogs have begun to list them with the full gum, and collectors are going after trying to find mint never hinged or full gum never hinged examples of these CTO stamps with the cancels. And some of them are quite expensive. So that's something to watch for. A lot of them have probably had the gum removed because people would try to fool collectors into believing they were used. Those you can usually identify merely by how thin the corner cancel is. Most genuine postal cancels on Australia have somewhat of a thickness to them. Usually at least 1/4 of a millimeter thick, you know, for the frame of the outer circle cancel. Whereas the CTOs that were used on the souvenirs, it's less than 1/4 of a millimeter thick, the line. So it's quite distinct. The last thing, multiples of this issue with what are called monograms and imprints are worth a lot of money. You'll see them in Australian specialized auctions. The Brusden White Australian catalog lists them individually with different monogram types for the different printers. The printer for the Kangaroo issues was there was John Ash that printed some of them, J.B. Cook, and T.S. Harrison. So you'll get different imprints for Ash, monogram, or Cook and Harrison. And they're all listed separately and priced, and all of them are worth significant amounts of money. So if you come across any of them in a large lot of Kangaroos that you buy at auction, pull them out. Don't separate them under any circumstances from the stamps. Yeah, that's about it. I really don't know much about postal history on this in terms of covers, so I don't have a lot to add there. But this will do for this video, and then join me for the next one where I'll discuss the George V heads. Thanks for watching. Bye.